Connu pour ses écrits sur l'écologie politique, Andreas Malm est professeur à l'université de Lund, en Suède. Mais avant de s'intéresser aux questions environnementales, son engagement intellectuel et politique commence en Palestine. Il n'a alors que 18 ans.
I visited Palestine for the first time in 1996 when I was 18 years old. And my family background is Christian, and half of my family on my father's side was and still is Christian Zionist, and the half on my mother's side is pro-Palestinian Christians. My uncle from my mother's side took me to Palestine on one of his trips in 96, and I got, of course, deeply moved by what I saw, as people tend to be when they actually touch ground in Palestine and see with their own eyes what's going on. And I couldn't leave the issue. I went back and forth for 8 years. I lived for half a year in the West Bank in 99, but I haven't been there on the ground in Palestine since 2004. But this was like my entry point into writing. My first books were about Palestine in Swedish. I was very active as an organizer and activist in the international solidarity movement during the Second Intifada.
À partir des années 2010, Andreas Malm se tourne vers le champ de l'écologie politique, et plus spécifiquement, il travaille sur le capitalisme fossile. Avec Pour la Palestine comme pour la Terre, l'auteur renoue avec ses engagements palestiniens et questionne l'articulation entre questions climatiques et la colonisation de la Palestine.
This text is essentially a lecture manuscript. So it's the result of an invitation I received to the American University of Beirut to come there and give a lecture in early April 2024. And of course, by that point, the genocide had been going on for half a year, and I, as many others, had difficult times thinking about anything else. So I was, kind of bursting with the desire to say something about this, because what I do mostly in my work is to say and write things. And I thought that the contribution I can possibly give to the discussion here is a historical one, because most of the research that I've done, or perhaps most of the research that I'd like to do, is historical in nature. So I went back to this story, to this research that I had done. I did a little bit of more research, but this was very hastily written over a few weeks. So it's not a deep, comprehensive inquiry by any means. It still just basically touches the surface of the historical material from 1840, and also of the bigger question, which is, how is the destruction of Palestine related to the destruction of the earth? What are the links between the occupation and the combustion of fossil fuels?
Andreas Malm n'est pas le seul à penser ces thématiques ensemble. De plus en plus, les mouvements écologistes et palestiniens ont tenté de faire front.
And a lot of people are interested in this articulation, including climate and Palestine activists who are actually, trying to put this into practice and engage in mass actions against the common enemy, which is precisely the fusion of fossil fuel companies and the occupation and all its supporters. The most famous example of this trend is, of course, the most famous climate activist that we've had on Earth, namely Greta Thunberg, who since October 7th has become as much of a Palestine activist as she is a climate activist.
I'm participating in this Code Rouge action today because the changes we need will not come from us asking nicely.
And has suffered quite a lot of demonization for that reason. There was an action just this week, last Monday, in Copenhagen, where Palestinian climate activists together took over the headquarters of Maersk.
We're currently outside Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, that only the last year, has shipped thousands of tons of military equipment to Israel to arm them during their genocide in Gaza.
So there is a growing awareness of the need to confront both of these things, the Western structure of support for the occupation in the Middle East and continuous expansion of fossil fuels, as actually one and the same target very often. And maybe the most concrete the most concrete aspect of this unity is the military-industrial complex, and more specifically the American military apparatus, being the world's single largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels. So there's no unit, entity, organization, whatever, in the world that burns as much fossil fuels as Pentagon, as the American military. And 5% of all CO2 emissions in the world on an annual basis comes from the militaries of the world, but this is in peacetime. So it's when it's based on, the military logistics of sustaining all the military hardware, keeping it ready for action and transporting things between bases and stuff like that. When an actual war starts, the emissions spike because modern warfare of the kind that we've seen in Gaza is very largely based on explosive combustion of fossil fuels, notably jet fuels used by the fighter jets that have pulverized Gaza. This is very often forgotten. It's more convenient, for instance, to talk a lot about civil aviation, because then you can take it down to the individual level and say you should avoid flying. But civil aviation accounts for 3% of annual emissions, so military emissions are almost twice as large. And but these military emissions are much tougher not to crack because they represent such incredibly strong power interests. Netta Crawford, who wrote a book about Pentagon and the climate crisis, but it's also, of course, the fact that, as she shows, the American military doesn't only consume fossil fuels, but it has for more than a century operated to secure access to fossil fuels. So it's in the DNA of American military power to ensure these supplies of oil and gas and then integrate them into the own workings of this military and burn those fuels and then get hold to more of these fuels and spread them to the rest of the economy. She calls this the deep cycle. And this is, of course, the broader context within what's happening in Gaza. For all practical purposes, the occupation army is an extension of the U.S. army. There's nothing that the Israeli occupation army does that isn't based on direct support from the US Army.
Dans son ouvrage, Andreas Malm dresse une série de parallèles et d'articulations entre les catastrophes climatiques et la question coloniale.
So what you've had in Gaza is a pulverization of that part of Palestine and a destruction of the people that lives there, in combination with this massive emissions spike, because the destruction has very largely happened through the combustion of fossil fuels. The example that I take in the book is these floods that hit Derna in Libya in September 2023, and that transformed that city into a pile of rubble, completely pulverized it.
Début septembre 2023, la tempête Daniel frappe l'est de la Libye. La ville de Derna est particulièrement touchée.
Ironically, you had teams of first responders moving from Gaza into Derna to try to help out and, extract the bodies from under the rubble, because they're used to dealing with this kind of pulverization from previous episodes of warfare. And then just a few weeks later, the genocide started in Gaza, and somewhat similar scenes played out, but on a larger scale, with more people killed and with, of course, another level of intentionality behind it, because the people in Derna weren't intentionally killed by generals and politicians and pilots who had decided that these people are going to die because of who they are. This is the genocidal logic of what happens in Palestine. But morphologically, as scenes of devastation, they were quite similar. And you see this actually being repeated if you look at the scenes of the neighborhoods in Los Angeles that were totally ravaged by the firestorms in January. They have a kind of an uncanny resemblance with what you see in Gaza, with these urban fabrics completely destroyed and turned into cinder and ash. Obviously, there are differences, but there are also, purely visually similarities. And the way that everything in Gaza is being polluted and contaminated and destroyed amounts to ecocide, because what was still there in terms of ecosystems agricultural lands, water reserves, the air, everything has become totally inhospitable to life, devastated for the long term. It's difficult to see how living conditions in Gaza can be restored.
Le 6 juin 2024, la rapporteuse spéciale des Nations Unies sur le droit humain à un environnement sain déclare:
L'une des conséquences dramatiques de la guerre à Gaza a été la violation massive du droit à un environnement propre, sain et durable, ce qui représente un risque sérieux pour l'existence. La région subit par ailleurs des conséquences climatiques graves qui pourraient encore empirer.
It's just one aspect of the genocide, because, genocide is the destruction in whole or in part of a particular group of people. And one way of executing a genocide is precisely by systematically targeting the foundations of life for this group of people. And that's precisely what you've seen in Gaza.
Le chercheur lie ici l'indifférence et l'intentionnalité.
So, for instance, you had this Likud member of the Knesset, Nassim Vitouri, who said that all adults in Gaza are guilty and they should all be killed. That's a call for the extermination of about 1 million people. This you don't see at the climate front. So, for instance, when 20,000 people died in the floods in Libya, or when people are starving in Southern Africa because of global warming, this doesn't happen because the people who invest in fossil fuel companies actually want to kill the Libyans or the Mozambican farmers because of who they are. Rather, the knowledge of this mass death is a processed fact and something that these investors know very well of, but don't care about. They're indifferent to it. So they have accepted it as a byproduct of their investment. And they continue with their investments in the knowledge that with these investments, they're actually going to kill multitudes of people in the global south. But it's not the identity of these people that is in their intention. They don't intentionally target these people because of their identity. So there's a difference. But there are also, there are overlaps, because much of what has been going on in Palestine has also taken the form of indifference, that, the occupation, when it targets parts of the resistance, knowingly kills 200 civilians in the process without caring for it. They're totally indifferent to this kind of collateral damage. And likewise, when the greater the knowledge becomes of how much mass death investment in fossil fuels is causing, the closer it comes to meeting the criteria of actual intentionality. Because if you do something and you are perfectly aware of the consequences, then it's very difficult to say that it's not part of your intention to produce these effects.
Pour raconter la collusion entre l'émergence du capitalisme fossile et la colonisation de la Palestine, Andreas Malm remonte un peu dans le temps. 1840. La montée en puissance du pacha d'Égypte, Mehemet Ali, menace la stabilité des empires. La Grande-Bretagne, qui pratique avec les Ottomans un libre-échange avantageux, s'inquiète de ce chef politique dissident, qui s'autonomise politiquement et refuse le libéralisme britannique. Ces tensions se cristallisent lors de la bataille d'Acre, au mois de novembre. Pour la première fois, l'armée britannique y déploie ses bateaux à vapeur.
The Royal Navy sent a squadron of 4 steamboats as the spearhead of the attack on Akka, and the steamboats were extremely effective in moving around on the battlefield outside of the port, outside of the walls of Akka, because steam engines would allow the captains to drive in the battlefield, regardless of the winds and the waves, and just take up the best positions and evade the shots coming from the defenders. So they proved their superiority through this flexibility, versatility in space, their mobility. And also, they proved probably their supremacy by hitting one of these steamboats, that ammunition depot, and causing this incredible explosion by hitting with projectiles the depot and igniting the whole city of Akka and turning it into a pile of rubble. I mean, the casualty toll is still unclear, but it's evident that thousands of people died and that the city was destroyed and that the defenders on the Arab side collapsed in more or less one stroke in this battle. This was the centerpiece of the war, and it caused an enormous amount of excitement and euphoria within Victorian Britain in the 1840s and for years after, because of the spectacle of British steam power in one blow destroying this stronghold of the Oriental enemy.
C'est bien cette supériorité militaire tirée des énergies fossiles, ici à travers le charbon et la machine à vapeur, qu'Andreas Malm place au cœur de son analyse.
What's, I think, interesting about the moment in 1840 is that all of this has been more or less running continuously since then. Ever since 1840, we've had a continuous process of Western encroachment and penetration into the Middle East further and further and further, and most intensely through the constant colonization and destruction of Palestine. It took decades before this really started. In Palestine, actual Zionist colonies weren't established in Palestine before the 1880s, but of course British control over the region really began in 1840. This was the moment in time when the Ottoman Empire was conclusively open to British power, and it was also the moment in time when Egypt, very crucially, was subjugated to British Empire. Egypt being the primary contender for an autonomous political project in the region that was crushed in 1840. And it was only after this that Egypt was properly subordinated as a periphery in relation to the British core. And in that sense, there was a continuity from this war of 1840 over the coming decades up to the full occupation of Egypt in 1888 and the 1882, and the increasing intrusion into the Ottoman Empire and the incipient colonization of Palestine. So what started in 1840 still hasn't ended. That's my point. Since Muhammad Ali was defeated, you've had a lot of episodes where new political formations in the Middle East have tried to carve out their own sphere of independence and their autonomous projects. And they have been beaten down again and again and again. And the Zionist entity has had precisely this purpose of beating them down, with Nasser and Arab nationalism being maybe perhaps the most important instance. This is also something that is continuously repeated. This is exactly the same story that we've had for almost 2 centuries. Where you have precisely this arrangement that the British imperialist visionaries were imagining in 1840, that you would have a settler colonial state in Palestine beholden to the Western Empire and making sure that its interests are taken care of, and guaranteeing that we don't have any autonomous political projects that, represent the interests of the masses in the region.
Cet expansionnisme occidental trouve aujourd'hui une traduction extrême avec la nouvelle administration américaine menée par Donald Trump. Le 26 février dernier, il partage une vidéo générée par intelligence artificielle montrant Gaza comme une Riviera américaine.
I think people who saw this video are just dumbstruck and really don't know what to say, because what words are left? What instruments from critical theory can we apply to this? Because it's just so over the top. It's just so hyper extreme. It's one of the most disturbing things I've seen. It's on that level. The genocidal intent here is so chilling, and it comes from the most powerful man in the world. And the richest man in the world, who's walking around there in Gaza throwing the dollar bills in the air. the level of total despair and disgust that this film inspires in people is understandable. It really is a culmination so far of 2 centuries of totally narcissistic urges from the West to dominate this region and destroy it and turn it into an image of itself and just further the accumulation of capital. And it's in a way it's fitting that this whole story ends with a picture of a massive golden statue of Trump in Gaza. As bizarre as it is, it follows a kind of a logic that has been running for a long time. There are so many psychic aspects to this. And when the fall of Accaparer happened in 1840, many observers in the Victorian elite in Britain thought of this as some kind of a dream come true or a miracle, and dreamed up this idea that we're going to gather all the Jews in Palestine and it's going to follow this eschatological scheme of precipitating the second coming of Christ and all of these things. So yeah, there was an element of total fantasy to this from the beginning. Then parts of this fantasy were realized. That dream is like drawn to its final conclusion in this film where the Palestinians have just disappeared and all you have is a mirror image of Western capitalist power in itself, in its own glory in Gaza. Yeah, what Trump has said over the past few weeks really is a way of normalizing the deep drives towards elimination that have fueled the Zionist enterprise from the beginning, but he's bringing them to the surface, and the far right and the whole political spectrum in Israel, with insignificant exceptions on the far left, are welcoming this position from Trump as, again, the realization of a dream, which has been the dream of Zionism from the beginning, Palestine without Palestinians. So in that sense, yes, this film is just a symptom of the moment, our moment, our conjuncture.
À travers son analyse historique, Andreas Malm démontre aussi comment l'État israélien s'est progressivement intégré au marché international des énergies fossiles, aux côtés des puissances occidentales.
So the state of Israel was for a long time a country fully reliant on import of fossil fuels, not producing them itself. But this has changed in recent years. Israel is now producing amounts of gas that are not insignificant, a little bit of oil as well, but primarily gas, and exporting volumes of those from these gas fields to the EU, for instance. There are several Israeli companies that are now involved in oil and gas extraction in the North Sea and in other places around the world. So there is a kind of a two-way process where you have foreign companies like Chevron and BP investing in the gas fields controlled by the occupation in the waters of Palestine and making sure that these fossil fuels can be exported. And you also have Israeli capital entering various zones of fossil fuel extraction around the world. And then, of course, part of this whole circuit is the continuous flow of oil and gas from other countries into Israel. And here, again, there is remarkable continuity. The main supplier of oil to Israel is Azerbaijan. The oil there is extracted by British Petroleum together with the Azeri National Oil Company. And then this oil flows to Israel through the Baku-Tbilisi-Cheyenne pipeline, which is operated again by BP. BP being British Petroleum. So, and this is the main source of oil to the state of Israel. Then another important pipeline, figuratively speaking, is the one that takes jet fuel from refineries in Texas to the ports in the 1948 areas, and then is used to fuel the fighter jets that pulverize Gaza. And yeah, there really is a remarkable continuity here that, again, has been in place since 1840, where the entity, the occupation, is plugged into the grid of fossil fuel circulation in the world economy and uses the power that it can draw from these supplies to destroy Palestine. It's a very, very deep structure, and it's interesting to see how it plays out. There's a great article by Zachary Keeler in the most recent issue of Middle East Report, where he shows like how this has continued from the period of the British Mandate when Britain occupied Palestine. The Yishuv, the Zionist colonies, they were systematically benefited by the establishment of fossil fuel-based infrastructure, such as coal-based electricity generation. And at the end of the mandate, the Jewish Zionist population accounted for about a third of the population in Palestine, but it consumed 90% of the electricity from the coal-powered stations that the British had established. And this was the general structure of the mandate, that in every respect, not only electricity generation, but if you look at the transporting of citrus fruits and things like that, the emerging entity, the Zionist colonies, were fully drawing on access to fossil fuel supplies coming from outside and using this power to establish itself as the new dominant force in the country vis-a-vis the Palestinians, who were cut off from these supplies or even unplugged from them, denied access to these energy sources. And it's precisely this pattern that has developed and continued to develop ever since then. And during the genocide in Gaza, we have seen this enormous mobilization of the power, the destructive power of fossil fuels, combined with denying Palestinian electricity. Yoav Gallant saying these are human animals, we're going to deny them any electricity. I think he made this announcement on October 8 or 9. I don't remember what date it was, but just short after October 7, very, very famously. And this is because the ghetto of Gaza has been structured in a way that everything that goes in can also be switched off. So the Palestinians, by being dependent on supplies of electricity and water from the state of Israel, have been totally hostage to the occupation, which can just, at the turn of a button, just stop all the flows, which is what they did, so that no electricity, no fuel would enter Gaza. And the way that the Palestinians in Gaza have tried to survive this has been to develop as much solar power capacity. During the genocide, you've seen the systematic destruction of the solar arrays, the solar panels in Gaza. This is going on in the West Bank too. But the Palestinians have again tried to adapt and, establish like communal charging stations in the tent camps with a few solar panels that are still there, or improvised wind turbines and things like this. So, the pattern of Zionist power being based on fossil fuels from the outside, and this power deployed to destroy the Palestinians who are cut off from this axis, is one that has just intensified over the decades and indeed centuries.
Récemment mis à jour, plusieurs champs gaziers au large de Gaza attirent les convoitises.
These gas fields outside of the shores of Gaza could potentially benefit the Palestinians there and be used by them as a source of kind of an energy independence. But of course, the state of Israel would not allow for that and have made sure that these fields will not be used by the Palestinians and that they themselves are going to use them. I mean, this is how the settler colonial project has been working all the time.
Au-delà de ces considérations historiques, Andreas Malm revient dans son livre sur ce qu'il appelle la théorie du lobby.
It's a theory meant to answer the question, why does the West support the state of Israel? And the answer proposed by this theory is that there is a Zionist pro-Israeli lobby that wields power, so much power that the lobby can manipulate the West and more or less coerce it into supporting the state of Israel, even when it is against the interests of the West itself. And I think this is a very deeply flawed theory. I don't think it conforms with the evidence. And one of the reasons I connect this to the historical material is that what happened in 1840 and for many decades after was that the British Empire established the notion of a Zionist colony in Palestine that would serve imperial interests without the existence of any kind of lobby. So you had a long period of Western support for this Zionist project preceding the very existence of a lobby. Maybe you can say that the lobby emerged around the time of the creation of the state of Israel, perhaps, that would leave us with more than a century of imperial support for the Zionist project without the existence of a lobby. And if you apply some kind of, analytical sharpness to this question, then clearly you find that you can have imperialist support for the state of Israel without the lobby being present whatsoever. But this is just one of the objections you can make to the theory. There are many others as well. You can draw a parallel to the question of fossil fuels. A Zionist lobby exists, and it has political influence in the US. Likewise, there is a fossil fuel lobby that exists in the US and has a lot of political influence. But if you want to explain why 80% of the world's energy comes from fossil fuels, and why this share is virtually the same decade after decade after decade, you cannot possibly explain this with reference to the power of the fossil fuel lobby in the US. It's a very minor factor, and it's epiphenomenal on the deep structural centrality of fossil fuels. And I think it's exactly the same with the lobby in relation to the alliance between empire and entity in the Middle East. The lobby exists, it has a political role, but it's a minor factor. And it's more like a symptom than a cause of this deep alliance. And it's really to put the cart before the horse, to, focus on something insignificant to hone in on the lobby. And it has, I think, potentially dangerous political consequences as well. This idea that, we have these powerful Jewish actors somewhere in the background who force us to do things against our will. It's not where we want to be politically or theoretically. And it's rather something that we should reject. But first of all, obviously, because it's, as these ideas tend always to be, empirically incorrect, I think.